Every moment of your life is being subtly influenced by unseen forces, crafting the very fabric of your reality. This 3-hour sonic experience offers a unique pathway into these hidden narratives, designed not just for relaxation, but for a profound shift in perspective. Let's start with first. Absence framing. Absence framing is not the art of lying. It is the art of omission. It is when the story you hear, or the history you inherit, is shaped as much by what is removed as by what remains. Every narrative is a selection, a carving away of infinite details until only certain ones are left. But when absence framing is deliberate, the omissions are not accidents, they are the scaffolding. They define the shape of the truth you think you know. Consider a news report that covers a political scandal, but omits who funded the campaign. You hear of the crime, the outrage, the trial, but not the hands that made the scandal possible. In the absence of those names, your mind builds its own image of the guilty. The missing information directs you, as invisibly as a hand on your back, toward a conclusion that might be entirely wrong. This is absence framing. Truth in fragments, carefully arranged, so the gaps become the most persuasive part. It is used in journalism, in politics, in corporate PR, but also in our personal lives. Think of a friend describing a breakup. They tell you how they were betrayed, how they were blindsided, how they were hurt, and maybe all of that is true. But they do not tell you about the months of distance, the unreturned calls, the cold silences they gave in return. You are left with a villain and a victim. And the villain is not them, because that version of events never entered your mind. The silence becomes the story. Absence framing can feel more powerful than an outright lie, because it carries the illusion of honesty. You are being told the truth, but only some of it. This makes the listener complicit. We fill in the blanks ourselves, believing we arrived at our conclusion independently. In reality, we were nudged there by an invisible architecture, the precise placement of what is shown, and the deliberate withholding of what is not. History is shaped this way. Entire generations grow up with schoolbooks that speak of victories but not massacres, of leaders' speeches but not their private orders. A single photograph in a museum can immortalize a soldier's heroism while erasing the burning village behind him. Even our memory works this way. We forget selectively. We retell our lives with edits so subtle we believe them ourselves. The night we made a cruel remark disappears. The one where we were insulted stays vivid. We become our own PR managers. In advertising, absence framing is everywhere. The cigarette ad from decades ago that showed smiling doctors in lab coats never said smoking was safe. But by showing only health, only sophistication, the absence of harm was louder than any claim. Today, tech companies present devices as tools for connection, but leave out the stories of addiction, isolation, and surveillance. The harm isn't denied, it's simply never brought into view. Even justice is not immune. In a courtroom, a lawyer can sway a jury not by fabricating evidence, but by carefully selecting which truths are shown. A piece of testimony, a photograph, a record removed from the timeline can change the entire emotional weight of the case. What is missing becomes the silent author of the verdict. But absence framing can also protect. Survivors of trauma often tell their stories without certain details, not to manipulate, but to shield themselves from reliving the worst moments. Parents soften the past for their children. Friends leave out truths they believe would destroy someone. In these cases, the omission is an act of care, but it is still framing. It still shapes reality for the listener. The danger lies in how invisible it is. Lies trigger suspicion. Omissions rarely do. We assume that what we're told is the whole story, unless we've been trained to look for the shadows. And the most dangerous absence framing is the kind we don't even recognize, when an entire culture accepts the same gaps in its story as normal. This is how myths solidify, how prejudice becomes law, how propaganda becomes heritage. The challenge, then, is not to demand every detail of every story. That is impossible. It is to ask, what is not being said? Who benefits from the silence? If the missing pieces were put back in, how would the meaning shift? In every speech, every article, every memory shared over coffee, there are ghosts in the negative space, shaping the truth as powerfully as the words themselves. Absence framing works because human minds are meaning-making machines. We see a few stars and draw entire constellations. We see a few facts and weave an entire reality. Those who master omission understand this, and they know that the sharpest blade is not what you say, but what you leave out. And once you start noticing the spaces in between, the silences in every story, you realize the world is built as much from what's hidden as from what's revealed. Selective silence. There's a tactic older than censorship, quieter than propaganda, and deadlier than open lies. It's not about shouting falsehoods into the crowd. It's about deciding what never gets said at all. Selective silence, the art of ignoring certain topics until they dissolve from public thought, like footprints in the tide. No announcement, no rebuttal, no visible struggle. Just absence. So complete it feels natural. And what isn't mentioned often becomes what isn't remembered. Think about how history is written. We imagine it as a complete record. Battles, speeches, disasters, revolutions, carefully stored and passed down. But it's not a complete record. It's a curated exhibit. Every archive, every school curriculum, every museum wall is the result of decisions. What to keep, what to hide, what to never admit existed. Wars are remembered for victories, not for atrocities. Leaders are celebrated for speeches, not for silences. And somewhere in the shadows lie events so carefully omitted that we don't even know what questions to ask. Selective silence doesn't always need a dictator's fist. Sometimes it thrives in democracies, corporations, even families. A government facing a scandal might not suppress it outright. They'll just refuse to address it. Journalists will ask, officials will dodge, and eventually the topic feels stale, irrelevant. Without fresh details, the public moves on, and the scandal's power dies quietly. In corporate boardrooms, selective silence works the same way. A product failure isn't denied, it's just not mentioned in press releases. Shareholders aren't told outright lies. They're given selective truths, polished and partial. And inside families, entire generations can grow up without ever hearing about the uncle who vanished, the crime that happened, the betrayal no one dared to name. It works because human memory isn't a hard drive, it's a living thing. It withers without nourishment. Mention something daily, and it grows vivid, sharp, unavoidable. Ignore it, and it begins to fade. By choosing not to speak, you're not just withholding information. You're actively shaping reality. Silence is not empty. It's a container. And in that container, anything too dangerous to say can be safely buried. Consider the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. For decades, it was almost absent from school textbooks, news archives, and public conversation. An entire neighborhood was burned, hundreds killed, thousands displaced. And yet generations grew up in Tulsa with no knowledge it had happened at all. It wasn't that the facts were erased. They were simply left untouched, unspoken, until the collective memory closed over them. Only when survivors began to speak out, when researchers and activists forced it into public discourse, did the silence crack. But by then, the damage was done. Evidence lost, perpetrators gone, descendants left without even the language to ask for justice. Selective silence is dangerous not only because it hides the truth, but because it hides the fact that anything is missing. With lies, there's at least the possibility of contradiction. Someone can shout, "That's not true." But with silence, there's nothing to contradict. No battle to fight, no obvious enemy. Just a slow erosion of what's real. It's like removing a beam from a building in secret. By the time anyone notices the collapse, it's too late to trace the damage. And here's the subtle cruelty. It doesn't just erase knowledge, it erases the right to know. If a question never occurs to you, you'll never demand an answer. Generations can live and die without even realizing that something was taken from them. That's why selective silence is so effective in shaping nations, industries, and personal legacies. It doesn't just rewrite history, it rewires the mind. The irony is that this silence often masquerades as peace. Leaders will say they're avoiding divisive topics. Corporations will claim they're focusing on the future. Families will insist they're protecting you from pain. And maybe in some cases, that's even true. But the result is the same. A gap in the record, a blind spot in perception, a wound that can't be healed because no one is allowed to see it. We think of free speech as the antidote, but speech is only free if it's actually used. Freedom to talk about anything means nothing if the culture has been trained to never bring certain things up. That's why, when you hear silence, you should listen harder. Ask why this isn't being discussed, why it's absent from the headlines, why people suddenly look away when the subject is raised, because every unspoken truth has two deaths. The first, when the event happens, the second when it disappears from memory. And in the end, it's often the second death that's permanent. The most dangerous thing about selective silence is that it works best when nobody notices it's happening. Which makes you wonder, right now, in your own time, in your own life, what aren't you being told? And more importantly, what have you already forgotten? Reflection bias. Imagine standing before a mirror that doesn't reflect you as you are, but as someone else wants you to be. The tilt of your head, the set of your jaw, the flicker in your eyes, carefully adjusted until the version staring back fits a story you never agreed to. That's reflection bias. It's not about lying outright. It's about showing only certain truths, certain fragments of reality, until those fragments become the whole picture in someone's mind. And the most dangerous part? It feels honest, because technically nothing shown is false. It's just incomplete. Think of a press conference where a leader stands in front of a cheering crowd, cameras zooming in on the applause, cutting away before the jeers begin. The footage is real, but it's not the whole truth. Or a company report that highlights the one profitable quarter while burying years of losses deep in an appendix no one will read. Or a relationship where one partner constantly recalls the moments of laughter, brushing past the silences, the fights, the subtle cruelties. In each case, the reflection is polished, curated, and weaponized, not to deceive with fabrications, but to control perception with selective truth. We humans are wired to trust what we can see. The brain treats visual evidence as reality's gold standard. When someone offers us a mirror, whether literal or metaphorical, we rarely question what it leaves out. And that's where reflection bias thrives. The mind fills in the missing spaces with assumptions that favor the narrative presented. Show enough smiling faces, and the audience assumes happiness. Highlight enough good deeds, and people believe in moral purity. This is why propaganda works best when it doesn't invent facts, but reframes them. Not a false picture, but a narrow one. History is littered with examples. During wartime, governments have long mastered the art of showing only victories and heroism, omitting images of the wounded, the starving, the disillusioned soldiers returning home. The Vietnam War marked a turning point, not because reality changed, but because the mirrors cracked. Television brought back images of body bags, burning villages, and protests. The reflection could no longer be controlled completely. Even in the corporate world, major disasters often begin with small omissions. The Challenger shuttle explosion was preceded by reports and photographs that were technically true, but edited to downplay risk. The executives saw only the reflection that confirmed launch readiness. The rest stayed in the shadows. In our personal lives, reflection bias takes subtler forms. Social media is perhaps its purest modern stage. We present carefully chosen slices of our existence, vacations, celebrations, successes, while cropping out the arguments, the loneliness, the failures. It's not always malicious. Sometimes, it's a defense mechanism, a way to shield ourselves from vulnerability. But when this curated self becomes the dominant version others see, it distorts how we're understood. Friends may envy a life we don't actually live. Strangers may believe in a confidence we don't feel. And over time, we might start believing it too, until the reflection becomes more real than the reality. Psychologically, reflection bias works because it engages the availability heuristic. People judge the truth based on the examples most readily at hand. If the mirror only shows the bright side, the dark side begins to feel improbable, even impossible. And once the mind settles into that pattern, contradictory evidence feels jarring, untrustworthy, an intruder in a familiar world. This is why cults, authoritarian regimes, and manipulative relationships all rely on controlling the reflection. They don't need to erase reality, just obscure the parts that threaten the narrative. The most insidious danger is that reflection bias is often invisible to those who use it. A leader may genuinely believe they are protecting morale by sharing only positive updates. A parent may think they're encouraging a child by praising their strengths and ignoring their struggles. But reality, when fractured, creates a slow dissonance. Eventually, the missing pieces surface. In rumors, in whistleblower reports, in quiet moments when someone finally looks away from the mirror. And when they do, the trust that was built on partial truths collapses more violently than if the whole truth had been told from the start. So, how do you guard against it? You start by asking not just, what am I seeing, but what am I not seeing? Who's holding the mirror? What angle is it tilted at? What's in the frame, and what's just out of it? You seek out unflattering perspectives, conflicting accounts, uncomfortable facts, because a complete reflection is rarely beautiful, but it's always more powerful than the prettiest fragment. And perhaps the most important question of all, when you hold the mirror for others, what parts of their reality are you leaving out? Because reflection bias isn't just something done to us. It's something we all, consciously or not, can end up doing. The next time someone hands you a mirror, remember, the danger isn't in the lie, it's in the truth that's been cropped. And if you're not careful, you'll spend your whole life staring at a stranger who only looks like you. History omission. History is never a perfect mirror. It's a sculpture, chiseled, polished, and, at times, deliberately chipped away until the shape that remains tells a story someone wants you to believe. History omission isn't about lying outright. It's about leaving gaps so strategic, so intentional, that the missing pieces reshape the whole picture. A war without its massacres, a ruler without his betrayals, a policy without its victims. When the wrong chapters are missing, the truth that survives is no longer the truth. It's propaganda wearing the costume of fact. Imagine a textbook describing a revolution where the people rose up and won their freedom, but never mentioning that half of them were starving, manipulated, or fighting against their will. The pages talk about banners and unity, not the child soldiers, not the purges, not the backroom deals with foreign powers. This isn't just a lighter version of reality, it's a different reality altogether. Generations who read it will carry a version of the past that feels complete but is built on absence. And the cruel part? They will never know what they were never told. Omission is a subtler weapon than fabrication. A fabricated event can be disproved if evidence survives, but an omitted truth is a ghost. There's nothing to point to, no wound to examine, no proof to contradict. And so, the lie lives in the silence. Governments have mastered this. Some will openly admit to restructuring archives, sealing documents for decades under the guise of national security. By the time those records are unsealed, if they ever are, the people who could contest them are gone, their voices swallowed by time. Consider how the Armenian genocide, for decades, was absent from many history books in certain countries. Not because it didn't happen, but because acknowledging it would shift modern alliances and open the door to demands for justice. Or think of colonial histories taught in the colonizers' nations, glossing over massacres, forced famines, cultural erasures. You might read about railways and administrative reforms, but not about villages burned to the ground, languages outlawed, sacred sites desecrated. The absence creates the illusion that the past was less brutal, more civilized, more justifiable. Even personal histories are vulnerable to omission. Families pass down stories about ancestors that quietly skip over the scandals, betrayals, and cruelties. You grow up hearing of a great-grandfather as a brave soldier, but no one mentions he served in an army committing atrocities. Memory becomes curated heritage, and the longer the omission survives, the more impossible it becomes to separate what really happened from what was allowed to remain. In modern times, omission works faster. Digital archives can be altered in minutes. News articles can be deleted without explanation. A scandal trending on social media today can be buried under floods of irrelevant stories tomorrow until it fades from public thought. The event still happened, but without constant reference, it slips from the collective memory. History is not only written by the victors, it is maintained by the editors. And the most dangerous part? When omission is paired with selective inclusion, you're told half the story with twice the detail. An empire's glorious victories are recorded down to the weather on the day of battle, while its defeats dissolve into vague mentions or footnotes. People trust the account because it is rich in detail. They never notice that it's rich only where it serves the narrative. The mind fills in the blanks unconsciously, believing it has the whole picture. We think of the past as fixed, unchangeable. But in truth, our understanding of it is as fragile as the documents, testimonies, and memories we rely on. Remove enough threads, and the fabric of history can be rewoven entirely. And this is why history omission is so potent. It doesn't just alter how we view the past, it dictates the choices we make in the present. If a nation omits its role in atrocities, it feels no urgency to make reparations. If it omits its history of exploitation, it feels justified in repeating it. So, how do we defend against a danger we can't see? The answer is vigilance, cross-referencing multiple accounts, seeking out suppressed voices, questioning why a particular event is missing from the official version. Sometimes, the most important part of history is not what is written, but what is absent. And when you notice those absences, when you feel the weight of what's missing, you begin to see how the present has been shaped not only by the truths we inherited, but by the truths that were stolen before we could ever know them. Because in the end, history omission is not the absence of facts, it's the presence of control. And whoever controls the record of the past quietly holds the pen that writes our future. Gap filling. There's a subtle kind of persuasion that doesn't shout, doesn't argue, doesn't even present a complete case. It simply leaves a gap, a missing piece in the story, and lets you fill it in yourself. And because the detail feels like your own conclusion, you trust it more than if it had been forced upon you. This is the quiet power of gap filling. It's not lying, not in the strictest sense. The facts given may be true. The problem is in the facts that aren't given, the spaces that the mind instinctively fills with what it already expects, fears, or hopes. We don't notice the manipulation because we feel like we reached the idea on our own, but we didn't. We were guided there. Imagine a courtroom trial where the prosecution doesn't say the defendant was at the crime scene. They simply mention that he owns a jacket just like the one worn by the culprit in blurry CCTV footage, and then they move on. The image lodges in your mind. You imagine the defendant in that jacket, in that alley, under that flickering light, and without realizing it, you've built the bridge between suspicion and certainty, even though nobody explicitly claimed it. Your mind hates gaps. It rushes to fill them, even if what you use to fill them isn't real. It happens in marketing too. An ad might never say, "Our product will make you popular," but it will show smiling groups, casual touches, someone laughing at a joke you told, with the product in your hand. They let you finish the thought yourself. Buy this, and you'll have that life. They know that if you arrive at that conclusion without them saying it, you'll defend it more fiercely, because it's yours. History is full of darker examples. During certain political purges, propaganda didn't always explicitly accuse individuals of treason. Instead, it would publish lists of loyal citizens, conspicuously omitting certain names. People saw the missing names and made the leap on their own. If they're not on the list, they must be enemies. No one had to say it. The absence spoke louder than words because the audience's imagination is a far more efficient enforcer than any single statement. Gap filling works because it turns the victim into a collaborator in their own deception. When you fill in the missing details yourself, you feel a sense of ownership over the conclusion. Your brain defends it as part of your own reasoning process, not as something planted in you. This is why cross-examinations, misleading documentaries, and even personal gossip often rely on implication rather than direct accusation. It's safer, harder to challenge, and more psychologically sticky. Think about rumors. Someone says, "I saw Sarah leaving that apartment building late at night," and leaves it there. If you already carry certain biases or suspicions about Sarah, your mind will leap to fill the gap with scandal. The person spreading the rumor never had to lie. They just lit a match and left you to build the fire. And here's where it becomes dangerous. Gap filling doesn't just alter what you believe, it alters how you believe it. Because you think you discovered it, you won't demand proof. You'll trust it like you trust your own memory. Even when evidence appears that contradicts it, you'll feel a quiet resistance to letting it go. After all, it wasn't them who convinced you, it was you. Journalism, when unethical, can abuse this technique with precision. Consider an investigative piece on corporate corruption that doesn't claim direct bribery, but notes that a CEO had lunch with a key government official the day before a major contract was awarded. That single, uncontextualized detail is enough for readers to imagine the entire corrupt transaction in their heads. If asked, the journalist can say, "I never said they were corrupt," and technically they didn't. But they didn't have to. The scariest part is that gap filling thrives in environments where people already have partial knowledge, strong biases, or emotional investment. If you're already inclined to think a politician is corrupt, you'll fill the gap with corruption. If you want to believe a miracle cure works, you'll fill the gap with hope. The manipulator only needs to position the gap in front of you and let your mind rush in. The antidote is uncomfortable, learning to live with an incomplete picture, to notice when your mind is supplying the missing piece, and to question it instead of accepting it. To ask, do I know this, or do I think I know this? But that's difficult in a world that rewards quick conclusions and punishes hesitation. Gap filling is silent, deniable, and extraordinarily effective. It weaponizes our need for narrative closure. It lets the storyteller hide behind half-truths, while making us believe we found the rest ourselves. And once we've done the work of completing their puzzle, we become loyal to the image we've built, even if that image was never real. Because sometimes, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, after someone hands us only half the story. Implication layering. Implication layering is the quiet art of shaping belief without ever saying the thing outright. It works by leaving a trail of suggestions, small, seemingly harmless details, that lead the listener to arrive at the conclusion you wanted them to reach, all while believing it was their own idea. It is persuasion without fingerprints, manipulation without accusation, and when done well, it's nearly invisible. Imagine a politician speaking about their opponent. They never claim the opponent is corrupt. Instead, they mention, almost in passing, that the opponent spent a lot of time with certain people who have been under investigation. They add that not all financial records were easy to verify. No direct accusation is made, but piece by piece, implication layers in the listener's mind. Questionable friends, murky finances, a hint of guilt. By the time the politician is done speaking, the seed has been planted, watered, and grown into a belief, without a single provable lie. This technique thrives in personal relationships too. A jealous friend might never say, "I think your partner is unfaithful." Instead, they remark that your partner's phone seems to buzz late at night, that they've been working late a lot, that they seem distracted lately. And each observation is true, each is also incomplete. But when stacked together, they create a framework for suspicion, and you do the rest of the work yourself. Implication layering is powerful because the listener becomes their own persuader. A direct statement invites doubt. You can challenge it, demand proof. But a hint, a nudge, an unfinished thought bypasses the defenses. We hate incomplete puzzles, so we fill in the missing pieces ourselves. And in doing so, we believe the conclusion more strongly because we think we arrived there independently. History shows entire propaganda campaigns built on this. During certain wars, state media would never explicitly claim that an ethnic group was dangerous. They would simply publish story after story of crimes committed by members of that group, always without broader context. Over time, the association became automatic. The public could not recall being told the group was dangerous. They just knew it, as if by instinct. This is implication layering at scale, an architecture of meaning built from hints and half-shadows. Advertising uses it too. A perfume commercial may never claim that wearing the scent will make you irresistible. Instead, it shows a glamorous figure walking into a room as everyone's eyes turn. The message is never spoken, but you connect the dots. Buy this, and you'll be desired. The human brain is wired to infer, to link cause and effect, even where none is stated outright. Marketers know this and build entire campaigns on it. Even in everyday conversation, implication layering can control the story. Consider a workplace scenario. A colleague wants your boss to think you're unreliable. They don't accuse you directly. Instead, in meetings they say, "Oh, I can handle that task since I know you're probably busy." They joke about your tendency to miss deadlines, even if you haven't. They casually recall the one time you forgot an email, making it sound like a pattern. Over weeks, the idea cements, not because of a confrontation, but because of a steady drip of suggestions. What makes implication layering dangerous is that it's hard to prove. You can point to an outright lie and call it false. You can confront someone about a direct accusation. But with implication layering, the manipulator can always retreat. "I never said that. You're reading too much into it." They hide behind plausible deniability, all while continuing to guide your thinking. But like all tools of influence, it isn't always malicious. Therapists sometimes use implication layering to help clients arrive at their own insights. Teachers use it to lead students toward an answer without giving it away. In these cases, the technique fosters growth and learning instead of distrust. The difference lies in intent, whether the hints are guiding someone toward truth or bending them toward a predetermined falsehood. The only defense against implication layering is awareness. When you feel yourself drawing a conclusion, pause and ask, was I told this, or did I infer it? What specific facts do I actually have, and which parts did I connect myself? When you strip away the scaffolding of hints, sometimes the structure of your belief collapses. And in that silence, you can finally see how much of what you knew was built not from what was said, but from what was carefully, purposefully implied. Omission by design. There's a kind of deception so elegant it doesn't feel like deception at all. It doesn't require shouting lies or burning books. It doesn't even require hiding the truth in locked vaults. Instead, it works by arranging the truth so artfully that the missing pieces feel unimportant. This is omission by design, the calculated structuring of information so that absence looks natural, harmless, even inevitable. It's not about what you don't know. It's about how you're made to believe you don't need to know it. A historian can write an entire account of a war, filling hundreds of pages with dates, speeches, troop movements, and treaties, yet leave out the massacres, the betrayals, the moments that would shift our understanding entirely. And because the story flows smoothly, because no obvious gaps are left dangling, we never stop to wonder what was left out. The narrative feels whole. The omission is invisible. The brilliance of this tactic is that it doesn't trip our mental alarms. When we spot a blatant lie, our instinct is to challenge it. But omission by design sidesteps suspicion by presenting a seamless frame, one where the missing details are not redacted, just absent from the picture, like a puzzle where entire pieces were never printed, but the edges were trimmed so neatly that the absence feels like part of the pattern. You see it in political speeches where leaders acknowledge a crisis by highlighting only the progress made, never the costs paid. They'll quote statistics that confirm their version of events, leaving out the numbers that tell a different story. The speech isn't technically false, it's just engineered so that the inconvenient truths sink into irrelevance. The audience leaves believing they've heard the whole picture, when in reality, they've only seen the well-lit corners. In journalism, omission by design can happen without malice. An editor trims an article to fit column space. A headline frames the story, so the most troubling aspect doesn't make the cut. But in the hands of power, it becomes deliberate architecture. During the lead-up to the Iraq War, intelligence reports provided to the public focused heavily on certain confirmed threats, while quietly excluding the dissenting assessments from within the same agencies. By the time those missing parts were revealed, the decisions had already been made, the war already underway. Even in everyday life, omission by design operates quietly. A resume emphasizes achievements, glossing over failures. A social media feed shows curated joy, never the private collapse behind closed doors. A family story passed down for generations will omit the scandal, the betrayal, the shame, until the absence itself becomes tradition. And because the presentation is smooth, nobody asks. The psychological trick here is context control. Humans understand events not in isolation, but in relation to the details surrounding them. If you frame a narrative so that those surrounding details are chosen carefully, you can change the meaning without changing the facts. Show a photograph cropped just right, and you can make a protest look like a riot, or a riot look like a peaceful gathering. The mind fills in the rest with assumptions, and those assumptions are built on what's presented, not what's missing. The most unsettling part? Once omission by design has worked on you, you won't even know what questions to ask. There's no flashing warning light, no hint of the gap. And because it doesn't feel like a cover-up, it rarely provokes outrage. Instead, it produces quiet certainty, the most dangerous kind of ignorance. Entire generations can be guided by such crafted absences. A country's self-image can be built on a story that never includes the atrocities it committed. A company's brand can thrive on selective history, erasing the labor abuses or environmental destruction in its past. And the public, confident they have the whole story, will defend that incomplete truth as fiercely as if it were complete. That's why omission by design is so effective. It doesn't erase the truth. It edits reality until the truth no longer matters. The missing parts don't feel hidden. They feel unnecessary. And once you've accepted a story that way, the truth could sit in plain sight, and you still wouldn't see it. So, the next time a narrative feels perfectly polished, ask yourself, not what's being said, but what's been so neatly left out that it no longer even feels like part of the story. Because the most dangerous lies are sometimes nothing more than truths arranged to make the missing pieces invisible. Absence amplification. Imagine a photograph with someone carefully cut out of it. At first, you might notice the jagged edge, the gap where a face should be, but over time, if no one speaks of that missing person, if no other photographs surface, the absence itself becomes a kind of truth. Your mind stops asking who they were and starts believing they were never there at all. That's absence amplification, the paradox where erasing something doesn't just hide it. It magnifies the belief that it never existed in the first place. It works because memory is fragile, and reality for most people is stitched together from the cues around them. If a fact, a person, or an event is persistently missing from those cues, the human brain doesn't keep holding the gap open. It quietly closes it. And when enough time passes, the absence is no longer suspicious. It's normal. It's the foundation of gaslighting, the silent engine of revisionist history, and one of the oldest psychological tools of control. Consider how oppressive regimes handle dissenting figures. It's not always about public trials or loud condemnations. Sometimes, it's subtler and more effective. The person's name vanishes from official documents. Their image is cropped from photographs. Textbooks omit their contributions. Public speeches never acknowledge them. Soon, new generations grow up, never knowing they existed. It's not that they were painted as villains. They were simply not painted at all. And in that void, the mind takes the simplest route. If there's no trace, there must have been nothing to trace. History offers chilling examples. In the Soviet Union, certain political figures who fell out of favor weren't just arrested, they were scrubbed from records entirely. Their faces were airbrushed out of photos with Stalin, their speeches destroyed, their names unspoken in public. To the citizens of the time, especially the young, it wasn't a story of a missing hero. It was simply no story. Over decades, absence hardened into non-existence. The same happened in ancient Egypt, when pharaohs like Hatshepsut were erased from monuments and temple walls so thoroughly that, for centuries, historians didn't even know she had ruled. Her reign wasn't debated. It was forgotten. Absence amplification also thrives in personal relationships. In families where a scandal or tragedy has occurred, there's often an unspoken pact to never bring it up. The absent subject, an estranged sibling, a parent who walked away, a child lost too soon, slowly fades from photographs on the walls, from the stories told at dinner. Eventually, younger family members may grow up unaware that this person even existed. The silence becomes so complete that when the truth finally emerges, it feels less like revelation and more like a distortion of reality. The danger is that absence doesn't just erase the past, it rewrites the present. When a fact is missing from the collective consciousness, people unconsciously adjust their understanding of the world to fit that void. In news media, if a certain event or crisis is ignored long enough, public awareness of it doesn't stay neutral. It diminishes to zero. Without repeated reminders, the human brain assumes irrelevance or fabrication. And once something is presumed to have never happened, disproving that belief becomes nearly impossible. Evidence is dismissed as fake, survivors are doubted, and witnesses are told they misremember. Psychologically, this effect works because of the illusion of completeness. We assume the information presented to us is representative of reality. If a piece is missing and no one points it out, our minds unconsciously adjust the puzzle to feel whole. It's the same mechanism that allows stage magicians to hide an object in plain sight. You only notice what you expect to see. Everything else vanishes. In our digital age, absence amplification has only grown more potent. Online, algorithms favor content that already has traction. If a topic is intentionally suppressed or quietly deprioritized, it effectively stops existing in the public feed. Without visibility, there is no conversation. Without conversation, there is no memory. And without memory, there is no reality. A truth that isn't seen might as well be a lie that was never told. To resist it, you have to train yourself to notice the silences. To ask, what's missing here? Who isn't being talked about? What stories aren't being told? Seek out the forgotten voices, the buried records, the inconvenient photographs, because absence is not proof of non-existence. It's often proof of deliberate erasure. And the moment we mistake the missing for the imaginary, we've already surrendered the truth to those who benefit from its disappearance. The scariest thing about absence amplification is that it doesn't require force. No prison cells, no burning of books, just silence, and the patience to let the world fill in the gaps on its own. The company doesn't deny the danger, it just drains the blood from it, dresses it in neutral tones, and releases it into the public sphere where it's too bland to cause alarm. This tactic is not reserved for politics or business. It thrives in the personal realm too. A friend borrows a large sum of money, promises to repay it, then disappears for years without a word. When you finally confront them, they admit they were wrong, but call it a lapse in communication. The phrase is neat, non-threatening, even gentle, and in that gentle framing, your justified anger feels disproportionate, as though you are the one making a mountain out of a molehill. That is the trap. It doesn't just reshape the truth, it reshapes your emotional response to it. The most insidious part is that understatement doesn't sound manipulative. In fact, it borrows credibility from its calmness. We are taught to mistrust the hysterical and respect the measured. A person who speaks softly, avoiding loaded words, feels trustworthy. So when someone uses understatement strategically, they cloak their wrongdoing in the tone of reason. We do not recoil from them. We lean in closer, thinking we are hearing the truth in its purest form. All the while, the severity of their actions is dissolving right in front of us. History is littered with these deliberate diminutions. A massacre reframed as civil unrest. Colonization reframed as expansion of influence. Forced labor camps described as re-education facilities. Genocide softened into population transfers. These phrases are not simply euphemisms. They are weapons. They strip horror of its power to provoke justice. They dull the blade of truth until it cannot cut through the apathy of the present. And the longer they are repeated, the more they replace the raw memory with a carefully trimmed one. Generations grow up knowing only the softened terms, never realizing the realities that once lay beneath them. Quiet understatement thrives in an information-saturated world. When every day brings a flood of headlines, the stories that survive are the ones framed as urgent. By labeling a crisis as minor, by choosing language that makes catastrophe sound like inconvenience, those who wish to escape accountability can ensure their wrongdoing slips past unnoticed. A cyber attack that compromises millions of bank accounts becomes an isolated security incident. A chemical spill that poisons a river is called a contained leakage. The damage is not lessened by the phrasing, but public reaction is. And perhaps that is the true genius of the understatement trap. It doesn't fight you, it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't have to win an argument. It simply asks you to react less, to care less, to pause instead of act. Outrage needs heat and speed. Understatement gives you coolness and delay. The longer you delay, the colder the truth becomes, until you can no longer remember why it once felt urgent. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Understatement exploits our discomfort with appearing over-emotional or irrational. If someone describes their own crime or failure as minor, and you react with great anger, you risk looking extreme in comparison. This imbalance forces many people to downplay their own reactions, to match the tone they're presented with. Slowly, the victim of wrongdoing ends up moderating their outrage until it fits the perpetrator's preferred scale. And once that happens, the battle for truth is already lost. It's important to understand that understatement is not always malicious. In some cases, it can be used to prevent panic, to maintain order in times of crisis. A leader might intentionally soften language while evacuations are underway to prevent chaos. But when understatement is used to protect the guilty, to bury the consequences of their actions, it becomes one of the most dangerous rhetorical tools in existence, precisely because it feels so harmless. The defense against it is awareness. Pay attention not only to the facts presented, but to the scale in which they are described. Ask what is missing from the emotional weight of a statement. Compare the tone to the impact. If the language feels smaller than the reality, question why. Sometimes the truth isn't being hidden at all. It's right there in front of you, just dressed in clothes too small for its size. And that is when you must resist the invitation to see it as trivial. Because when a wildfire is described as a spark, when a massacre is described as unrest, when a betrayal is described as a misunderstanding, the danger has not diminished. Only our will to face it has. And that is exactly how the understatement trap wins. Muted majority. There's a kind of silence that's not natural. It doesn't come from agreement or peace or lack of interest. It comes from being pushed out of the conversation entirely. This is the muted majority, the act of silencing the largest group, so only the loudest, smallest, and often most extreme voices are heard. And once it's done right, the audience forgets there was ever anyone else speaking. It starts with the oldest trick in the book, controlling the channels of expression. You don't need to convince the majority they're wrong. You just need to make it harder for them to speak, and even harder for them to be heard. Sometimes it's literal, shutting down publications, censoring speeches, banning assemblies. Other times it's softer, subtler, drowning out their words with endless noise, giving platforms only to those who say what you want said, or setting the terms of debate so the majority's view doesn't even fit the format. History is full of moments where the loudest voice was never the truest representation of the people. In pre-revolutionary France, much of the population lived in crushing poverty. Yet court gossip and aristocratic disputes dominated the official record. The peasants' grievances were everywhere, in markets, in taverns, in fields, but nowhere in the narratives the elite consumed. Their silence wasn't because they had nothing to say. It was because their voices were excluded from every place that counted. It happens in modern media ecosystems too. Imagine an issue where 80% of the population supports a reasonable, moderate position. But if the media only gives airtime to two extremes, one radical on one side, one radical on the other, the middle disappears. Viewers come away believing the country is evenly split between those two radical camps. The majority becomes invisible, erased not by lies, but by omission. Social platforms magnify this distortion. Algorithms reward outrage, novelty, and emotional extremes, not consensus. A calm, balanced majority post might get 10 shares. An inflammatory minority rant might get 1 million. Soon the majority's reality is buried, while the fringe's reality is trending. People scrolling through their feeds assume that's where the real conversation is happening, when in truth, it's where the conversation has been hijacked. In workplaces, the muted majority might be the employees who quietly disagree with a reckless decision, but never speak up in meetings. Why? Because the one or two people who dominate the room are aggressive, dismissive, or backed by leadership. Over time, silence becomes self-preservation, and the dangerous illusion takes root that everyone is on board. Decisions are made in this false consensus, with no one realizing that most people never agreed in the first place. The danger isn't just misrepresentation, it's the way the silence rewrites reality. If the majority is invisible long enough, they start to doubt themselves. They wonder if they really are alone, if their view is outdated, if maybe they've misunderstood the facts. And once self-doubt sets in, the fringe doesn't even need to work as hard to dominate. They've already won. The most effective silencing doesn't come with gag orders. It comes from changing the environment until the majority stops trying. Why risk speaking up if you know your voice will be buried, mocked, or ignored? Why stand in the spotlight if you've been trained to believe it's not for you? At that point, the muted majority isn't just silent. They're erased. To break this, you have to look for who's missing from the conversation, not just who's speaking. You have to ask whether the most amplified voices actually match the most common views. And you have to remember that in human history, what you hear the most has rarely been the full story. It's been the story someone wanted you to hear. Because when the majority is silenced, the truth doesn't just whisper, it vanishes. And all that's left is the echo of the fringe, bouncing back and forth, convincing the world it's the whole choir. Shadow facts. Shadow facts are the kind of truth that never walk in daylight. They exist, but only in whispers, true enough to sting, yet buried deep enough to be dismissed. They live in the narrow space between proof and denial, where a fact's very obscurity becomes its own executioner. The strategy is subtle. Don't erase the truth. Just release it into the world in such a way that it can only survive as rumor. Over time, the truth rots, not because it's false, but because no one will believe it anymore. Imagine a corporation caught dumping toxic waste into a river. The evidence exists: internal memos, shipping logs, eyewitnesses. But rather than silence it entirely, the company lets a fragment slip. They ensure it appears first in fringe blogs, carried by sources with questionable reputations. They mix it with wild exaggerations, like claims of secret genetic experiments in the same river. Now, when someone mentions the contamination, it's tangled with the ridiculous. The listener smirks, shakes their head, and says, "That's just one of those conspiracy things." The truth is there, but its credibility has been poisoned. This is the essence of shadow facts. Truth made so murky, so wrapped in absurdity, that even those inclined to believe it feel the ground shift beneath their certainty. The same technique is used in politics. A damaging truth about a candidate, say an illicit deal or a personal betrayal, leaks early in a sloppy, unverifiable form. It circulates without solid evidence, gets debunked once, and from then on, any later documented version is waved away with, "We've already heard that, and it was fake." The real proof arrives too late. The public's trust has already been trained to reject it. There's a historical precedent for this in Cold War intelligence. Declassified records show that both Eastern and Western intelligence agencies would leak genuine information about covert operations to foreign journalists, but paired with invented details. The combination made the whole story look like nonsense. When the enemy tried to act on the true parts, they couldn't separate them from the lies. The truth was hidden not by secrecy, but by camouflage. In media, shadow facts thrive in the comment sections and obscure corners of the internet. A whistleblower might reveal that a pharmaceutical company knew a drug had severe side effects, but before the story hits credible outlets, it appears on an anonymous message board alongside posts claiming that the same drug causes mind control or cures aging. The more outlandish the company can make the conversation, the safer they are. The truth is still technically public, but now it lives in a swamp where serious minds don't dare step. Even in personal lives, shadow facts can be weaponized. In a workplace, someone who wants to undermine a rival might reveal a real mistake they made, but in a setting that makes it seem like gossip. "I heard," they'll say, "that Alex accidentally deleted an important client file, but you know how people exaggerate." The listener hears it, files it away as rumor, and still can't help feeling a shadow of doubt about Alex's competence. The fact's power remains, but its credibility is crippled. This tactic is dangerous because it manipulates two deep instincts: our suspicion of hearsay and our love of plausible deniability. We want to avoid looking gullible, so we reject anything that smells like rumor. At the same time, those spreading the shadow fact can say they never claimed it was true. They're just passing along what they heard. The more the truth is repeated in this form, the more it becomes radioactive, too dangerous to touch, even for those who might otherwise champion it. And yet, shadow facts have another, more insidious effect. Even when dismissed, they plant a faint residue in the mind. People may publicly scoff at a rumor, but privately, it lingers. A whispered accusation, even if rejected, can change the way someone is seen. The damage is both invisible and irreversible. Once an idea has been heard, it cannot be unheard. You can't erase the faint outline it leaves behind. The most chilling part of shadow facts is how they can be deployed preemptively. If an organization suspects a real scandal might one day emerge, they can release a distorted version of it early, in unreliable form. Then, when the real evidence surfaces years later, the public has already been conditioned to treat it as old, discredited news. The truth is sabotaged before it even arrives. To guard against this, one must train themselves to separate the source from the substance. A fact does not become false because it comes from a questionable mouth. Likewise, a detail does not become true simply because it's repeated often. The work lies in verifying, in refusing to let the packaging dictate whether we open the box. But in an age where information is a flood and credibility is currency, most people don't have the time or the will to sort through the debris. And that is exactly why shadow facts remain one of the most effective tools for burying the truth in plain sight. By the time a shadow fact has done its work, no one has to hide it anymore. It can sit in the open and no one will touch it. Not because it's dangerous to know, but because it's embarrassing to believe. And that is the final, cruel genius of it. The truth doesn't die. It's left alive, limping through rumor, too wounded to fight, and too tainted to save. Closed questioning. Some of the most dangerous lies aren't hidden in the answers. They're hidden in the questions themselves. Closed questioning is the art of shaping an inquiry so narrowly, so precisely, that it will never wander into dangerous territory. It's not about silencing someone directly. It's about guiding them into a cage made of their own responses. And the walls of that cage are built from the way the question is asked. In courtrooms, politicians, classrooms, boardrooms. Closed questioning thrives wherever people can control the boundaries of a conversation. Imagine a government hearing on a controversial military operation. Instead of asking, "Why was the operation launched without international approval?" the question becomes, "How many troops were involved in the mission?" One question scratches the surface of logistics. The other threatens to pierce the heart of legality. And because the first is easier to answer, it's the one that's asked. The room feels satisfied. A question was asked, an answer given. The deeper truth remains untouched. It works because the human mind trusts the shape of a question. If something important were being avoided, surely someone would ask about it, right? But when every question is crafted to skim along the edges of the real issue, the illusion of accountability is maintained, while the truth stays locked away. You see it in journalism too. A corporate CEO accused of environmental damage is interviewed on live television. Instead of asking, "Will you compensate the communities whose water you poisoned?" the reporter asks, "What's your company doing to promote sustainability?" The second question gives the CEO a polished runway for PR talking points. The first could trap them in an admission. The difference isn't in the answers. It's in whether the question ever points toward the wound. In authoritarian regimes, closed questioning is institutionalized. Press conferences are scripted. Approved journalists are given lists of safe topics. Inquiries about human rights abuses are reframed into discussions about national unity or security priorities. The public sees officials responding to questions and assumes openness, when in reality the entire conversation has been pre-selected to protect the powerful. The forbidden questions simply never appear. But closed questioning isn't limited to the halls of power. It happens in families too. A child asks about a missing relative and hears only, "Why are you curious about that?" Or they're told, "Don't you think it's better to focus on your schoolwork?" The question is deflected, reframed, or replaced, and the door to truth quietly clicks shut. Over time, the absence of certain questions becomes habit, then culture, then silence passed down like an heirloom. The genius, and the danger, of closed questioning is that it often doesn't feel like censorship. People leave the room believing the matter was discussed, that nothing was hidden. After all, questions were asked. A conversation happened. What they don't realize is that it was a conversation built on rails, with every track leading away from the place they were never meant to reach. This technique is especially effective in public scandals. When a politician is accused of corruption, the press conference will be filled with questions like, "What will you do to regain the public's trust?" Or, "Do you think this controversy will affect your chances for re-election?" These are safe questions. They address perception, not guilt. They allow the accused to stay in the realm of image management instead of truth-telling. The uncomfortable areas, names, dates, money trails, remain untouched. Psychologically, closed questioning exploits our comfort with structure. When someone else frames the inquiry, we feel guided, even reassured. We rarely pause to ask, "Why this question? Why not another?" And in that unasked moment, entire truths can vanish. In the legal system, the tactic can be deadly. A defense attorney might narrow a witness's testimony to yes or no answers, steering away from open-ended questions that might reveal damaging facts. The truth could be sitting just a breath away, but the form of the question builds a wall around it. The most chilling thing about closed questioning is how invisible it is. We notice when someone refuses to answer. We notice when someone changes the subject. But when someone asks a question that seems reasonable, just not quite the right one, we rarely feel the alarm. And yet, in that small shift, the entire conversation is controlled. This is why it's one of the most powerful tools for controlling narratives, because it gives the illusion of inquiry without the danger of discovery. The audience thinks the hard work of questioning has been done, and so they stop looking for the cracks. Which leaves us with the uncomfortable truth. The greatest secrets are often protected not by locked doors or erased files, but by questions that were never meant to open them. And if you've never heard the question, you might never even know what answer you were missing. Cognitive gap planting. Imagine teaching a child about the world, but leaving certain parts out. Not because you don't know them, but because you want to decide later what those missing parts will be. You describe the sky, but never mention stars. You explain history, but skip entire decades. You talk about how decisions are made, but never name who makes them. In those blank spaces, you're not just withholding information. You're planting fertile soil you can later seed with whatever truth you choose. This is cognitive gap planting, and it's one of the most powerful and dangerous tools of influence that exists. It doesn't work like a lie. A lie risks being exposed. This works by building an incomplete reality, then letting the mind do the rest. Humans can't stand gaps in understanding. When something is missing, we reach for whatever fits, even if it's wrong. And when the person who first left the gap is also the one who eventually fills it, their version doesn't just seem plausible, it feels inevitable. They become the source of clarity in a fog they created. Think of colonial powers rewriting the history of the lands they conquered. Schoolbooks in those territories often started their historical timelines with the arrival of the colonizers, as if nothing worth recording existed before. Generations of students grew up with an unspoken void where their ancestors' achievements should have been. Later, when official narratives finally offered an explanation for that empty time, people accepted it with little resistance because they had nothing else to replace it. The truth had been erased not through contradiction, but through omission. This tactic is equally potent in politics. A government might deliberately withhold key information about a crisis, say the true cause of an economic collapse, while feeding the public just enough details to know something went wrong. Into that vacuum, they can later insert a scapegoat, a minority group, an enemy nation, a political opponent. The public, desperate to make sense of the chaos, latches on. And because the explanation comes from the same authority that controlled the flow of information from the start, it feels trustworthy. The lie isn't replacing the truth, it's filling a hole where the truth never arrived. Cognitive gap. Planting thrives in personal manipulation too. In abusive relationships, one partner might withhold crucial context about their own actions or the intentions of others. They create small confusions, a missed detail here, an unexplained absence there, until the other person is used to not knowing the whole picture. Later, when the abuser provides an explanation, no matter how twisted, it slips easily into place. The gaps have already shaped the way the victim thinks, making certain lies feel like the only possible answers. Modern media ecosystems make this tactic nearly effortless. News outlets can choose to cover an event without certain essential facts, letting speculation simmer in the public mind. Social media influencers can present a problem, pause, and let their followers stew in uncertainty, until the real explanation drops in their next video. The effect is stronger if the gap is emotionally charged. When people feel fear, outrage, or confusion, their need for closure intensifies, and they become more receptive to whatever fills that gap. The psychology behind this is straightforward but ruthless. Our brains are meaning-making machines. We rely on patterns and continuity to understand reality. A gap disrupts that continuity, and we experience it as mental discomfort. This is the Zeigarnik effect. We remember incomplete information better than complete information, precisely because it nags at us. The longer the gap remains, the more our minds crave resolution. When the resolution comes, it doesn't just inform us, it relieves us, and that relief can be mistaken for truth. This is why intelligence agencies have historically used cognitive gap planting in disinformation campaigns. During the Cold War, agencies would leak partial, context-free intelligence into public discourse, hinting at secret enemy operations without offering full details. These gaps bred speculation, rumors, and paranoia, conditions in which carefully timed revelations could steer public opinion exactly where they wanted it to go. The public never realized the entire story was engineered from absence to answer. The most insidious thing about cognitive gap planting is that it can feel harmless in small doses. A parent might leave certain topics unexplained to control when and how their child learns about them. A company might withhold part of a product's failure story until they can craft a reassuring narrative. But scaled up, this becomes a way to engineer belief systems from scratch. By deciding where the blanks are, you decide which truths can fit inside them later. To protect yourself, you have to get comfortable living with uncertainty. Resist the urge to accept the first answer that comes after a long silence. Ask why that gap existed in the first place. Who benefits from you not knowing? Who had the power to tell you earlier and chose not to? Sometimes the most revealing truth is not in what's said, but in how long it's been kept unsaid. Cognitive gap. Planting doesn't just shape what we know, it shapes what we're able to know. It's not a battle of facts, it's a battle over the empty spaces between them. And if someone controls those spaces, they control the future shape of our reality. Because once the seed is planted, you'll remember the growth, but forget the gardener. Fading relevance. Some truths don't die with an explosion. They fade like old paint, slowly, silently, until one day you look at the wall and realize the color is gone. Fading relevance is not the act of denying a problem or erasing it. It is the art of letting it sink beneath the surface of collective thought until it becomes background noise. It is how scandals that should have reshaped history become trivia questions. How injustices that once filled the streets with protest end up as quiet, unremarked footnotes in an old newspaper archive. It begins with urgency. A tragedy breaks. A whistleblower comes forward. A leak exposes corruption at the highest levels. For a moment, the world stops to listen. Politicians scramble. Journalists investigate. Social media erupts. It feels like something will change this time. And yet, without anyone needing to tell us to forget, the fire begins to cool. A new crisis takes the headlines. A celebrity divorce swallows the news cycle. The algorithms feeding our attention find fresher outrage to serve us. The original story is still there, buried 3 pages deep, but it no longer feels alive. This is the secret. Our memory is fragile, and our focus is short. Fading relevance doesn't require suppression. It only requires patience. Those in power know that if they can weather the first wave of public attention, time will do the rest. The world does not have the capacity to stay equally angry forever. A few weeks of silence, a few distractions, and what once felt unbearable becomes a relic of last month's problem. You can see it in the aftermath of corporate disasters. A tech giant leaks the personal data of millions of users. For a brief window, customers rage, lawsuits are announced, and the company's name becomes synonymous with negligence. But slowly, the tide shifts. New features are released, new products are launched, and the headlines move on. The company didn't have to erase the breach from history. It only had to survive until people were tired of hearing about it. Within a year, most users have forgotten the outrage entirely. In politics, fading relevance is a deliberate strategy. A damaging report might be released on a Friday evening, knowing that by Monday, other stories will crowd it out. A scandal might be met with vague promises of an investigation that drags on for years until the public no longer remembers what it was about. Sometimes there is no cover-up because none is needed. Just the quiet confidence that the news cycle is an eraser with an endless supply of pages to overwrite. Even in movements for justice, fading relevance can be fatal. A protest erupts after a horrific incident. Speeches are made, policies promised, and for a brief moment, it feels as though change is inevitable. But as the weeks pass, coverage wanes, leaders pivot to other priorities, and momentum dissolves. Without sustained attention, the machinery of power reverts to its old patterns. The injustice remains. Only the noise surrounding it disappears. On a personal level, fading relevance is just as destructive. You confront a friend about a betrayal. At first, they apologize profusely, promising to make it right. But days pass, then weeks. You stop bringing it up because it feels repetitive, awkward. Soon, the wound is still there, but unspoken. The relationship appears healed, not because it was repaired, but because silence has replaced the conversation. The pain didn't fade. It was simply pushed into a place where no one looks. The psychology behind fading relevance is simple but ruthless. Humans are wired for novel. Our attention naturally drifts toward what is new, shocking, or urgent. The moment something stops feeling immediate, it slips into the category of already processed, even if it is still unresolved. Those who understand this can weaponize it. They don't have to win the argument or fix the problem. They just have to keep you looking elsewhere until your own brain decides it's no longer worth holding on to. And yet, the consequences are profound. When an environmental disaster fades from public awareness, companies avoid costly reforms. When human rights abuses vanish from the news cycle, perpetrators face no pressure to stop. When historical injustices are allowed to fade into academic obscurity, the conditions that created them often resurface. Fading relevance is not passive. It is a force that protects the powerful and punishes the vulnerable by erasing the pressure for accountability. There's a reason some truths need constant repetition to survive. Memory is not a vault. It's a fire that must be fed. Without the fuel of attention, it goes cold. That's why some activists keep repeating the same statistics, telling the same stories, year after year. They know that relevance is not permanent. They know that without vigilance, the world will move on, even if nothing has changed. And perhaps the most dangerous part is this. Once an issue has faded, reviving it becomes harder than keeping it alive in the first place. People resist reopening wounds. They don't want to be reminded of their own inaction. A story that resurfaces after fading feels like old news, even when it's still a living crisis. This is how tragedies linger in plain sight, ignored, not because they are resolved, but because they are remembered just enough to feel familiar, yet too little to spark action. Fading relevance thrives in the spaces between outrage and resolution. It teaches us that forgetting is easier than fighting, and that comfort is more appealing than confrontation. It leaves the truth intact, but starves it of the one thing it needs to survive, attention. And if we don't learn to notice when an important truth is quietly slipping away, we will one day wake up to find that the world has changed. Not because the lies were louder, but because the truth simply ran out of time. Because the real danger isn't that the truth will be destroyed, it's that it will be ignored until it no longer matters. And when that happens, the damage is not just to history, it's to the future. Silent substitution. There's a kind of manipulation so quiet, so frictionless, that most people never notice it happened at all. It's not the clash of two ideas fighting for dominance. It's the slow swap of one for another, done without announcement, without confrontation. One day you're certain of a truth, and months later, you're certain of a different one, without ever remembering the moment you changed your mind. This is silent substitution, the art of replacing one idea with another while making it feel like nothing has changed. It begins with familiarity. People anchor themselves to what they already believe, what they've always been told, what's already woven into their sense of reality. That's why the shift has to be gradual. If you rip the old idea away suddenly, people resist. But if you bend it 1 degree at a time, each new step feels close enough to the last that no alarm bells ring. The original idea is slowly hollowed out and rebuilt until it's something else entirely. History offers examples so subtle they read like sleight of hand. In wartime, governments have reframed their objectives without ever admitting it. A war that began as a mission to protect the homeland morphs into a campaign to liberate oppressed peoples. Speeches begin to use different phrasing. News reports highlight different goals. Textbooks, when revised, describe the past in slightly altered language. And yet, because each change is small and unannounced, the public accepts the new purpose as if it had always been the original one. You see it in corporations, too. A company launches with a bold mission, say, empowering small creators. Over time, strategic choices start favoring big-name partners. Marketing materials swap out words like independent for innovative, grassroots for global. The brand identity remains familiar enough that loyal customers don't notice the mission's soul has been replaced. Only when the results no longer match the original promise do they realize they have been supporting something different all along. Silent substitution thrives in personal relationships as well. Imagine two friends who've always shared a particular tradition, say, meeting every month to talk openly about life. One day the tone changes. The conversations become more about one person's needs than mutual sharing. The meeting still happens. The location is the same. The ritual looks identical from the outside, but its meaning has been quietly rewritten. The original purpose has been substituted, and unless someone points it out, both may carry on without consciously noticing the loss. The tactic works because the human brain craves continuity. We dislike admitting that something we believed yesterday might no longer be true today. So, when an idea is replaced slowly enough, we rewrite our memories to match. Psychologists call this retrospective consistency, the tendency to remember the past in ways that justify our present beliefs. It's why propaganda doesn't just tell you what to think now. It reshapes how you remember what you thought before. Media narratives often exploit this. A controversial figure might first be introduced as radical or dangerous. Over time, the descriptors soften. Divisive, then unconventional, then visionary. No one ever declares, "We've changed our stance on this person." But the steady rewording subtly shifts public perception until the original label disappears from collective memory. The figure's reputation has been rehabilitated without a single formal apology or admission of error. The danger of silent substitution isn't just that it changes what you believe, it erases the fact that you ever believed something else. It rewrites the timeline in your head so seamlessly that you can't pinpoint where the change began. This makes it nearly impossible to question because you feel as though you've been consistent all along. It's a manipulation that hides not only the act of persuasion, but the very existence of persuasion. Resisting it requires more than fact-checking. It means actively revisiting your own beliefs and comparing them to what you recall believing before. It means asking, when did this change? Who changed it? And why? It means refusing to accept the comforting illusion that your worldview has remained untouched. Because the most dangerous lies aren't the ones you're told. They're the ones that quietly take the place of truths you used to know, while leaving you certain nothing has shifted at all. Silent substitution doesn't need your agreement. It just needs your inattention. And if you give it that, it can rewrite your reality without ever making a sound. Single-thread narrative. A single-thread narrative is not just a story, it's a funnel. Everything that could be said is pushed aside so that one version of events runs straight, uninterrupted, into the listener's mind. It is the discipline, and sometimes the weapon, of choosing one plot line so completely that all other threads of reality vanish. And once a mind follows that single thread, it rarely looks sideways to see what's been cut away. It works because human attention is narrow. We can track multiple subplots in fiction, but in real life, under urgency, emotion, or stress, we hold on to one story at a time. Whoever controls which story is being told controls what is remembered. Imagine a high-profile trial. The defense keeps all questioning, all media interviews, all closing statements locked onto the theme that their client is a family man, devoted father. No matter what evidence surfaces about shady business deals or unethical behavior, it is left untouched, never expanded upon. The jury's mental space is saturated with one repeating image. The rest fades like scenery beyond the edge of a flashlight beam. History is full of leaders who mastered this art. A ruler facing famine may focus speeches entirely on a military victory, turning every interview, every public appearance, into a chapter in the same triumphal story. Citizens go to bed thinking about the victory, wake up thinking about the victory, while the famine exists, but off camera. It's not that people forget the other issues entirely, but the emotional weight is pulled elsewhere. The thread becomes the rope that pulls attention away from what might unravel the illusion. The single-thread narrative is especially effective in crisis communication. A company under fire for multiple scandals will pick the one most favorable to them, or the one they can spin, and talk about nothing else. If a tech giant is accused of privacy violations, labor exploitation, and tax avoidance, they might flood media channels with statements about our commitment to user security. Interviews repeat it, press releases repeat it, advertising repeats it. The labor exploitation thread dies in silence, the tax avoidance thread disappears, and the chosen thread grows thicker, stronger, and unbreakable in the public mind. It's a tactic used in personal relationships too. Picture someone explaining a breakup. They tell everyone about the fundamental incompatibility and talk at length about values, life goals, and differences. That becomes the only narrative anyone hears. The parts about dishonesty or betrayal never make it into conversation. By keeping all talk anchored to one safe thread, the dangerous ones are starved of oxygen. What makes this method so potent is that it doesn't feel manipulative in the moment. A story with a clear, consistent focus feels coherent, even trustworthy. Our minds are comforted by simplicity, by repetition, by having one emotional anchor instead of scattered fragments. But that comfort is the trap. Every time you follow only one thread, you stop weaving the others into the fabric of truth. Sometimes, the single-thread narrative is not about hiding a crime, it's about magnifying one. A government may choose one symbolic act by an enemy and frame the entire conflict around it, ignoring decades of context. A protest movement might spotlight one dramatic injustice while setting aside the smaller, more complex grievances. This isn't always malicious. Focus can rally action, drive change, and keep movements from collapsing under complexity. But in the wrong hands, it can make the world seem like a tunnel, dark everywhere, but where the storyteller holds the light. In the age of digital media, this effect is amplified. Social platforms reward the single-thread narrative because algorithms love consistency. One message repeated in different formats gets more traction than several messages competing for attention. Hashtags, slogans, viral sound bites. These are the modern weapons of single-thread focus. The more they are repeated, the more alternative threads are not just ignored, they are algorithmically erased from view. The defense against it is hard because it requires an active resistance to narrative gravity. When you hear a story told again and again, ask yourself, what am I not hearing? What's being left out, not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient to the chosen frame? This questioning takes effort, and effort is what most people avoid. That's why this tactic works so well, not because the hidden threads are impossible to find, but because the chosen one is so easy to follow. In the end, a single-thread narrative doesn't erase the other stories. It buries them alive, beneath the weight of the one that survives. And unless someone digs for the rest, that lone thread becomes the whole tapestry, no matter how many missing pieces are hidden just outside the frame. Information blackout. There is a kind of control so absolute, so clean, that it doesn't even leave fingerprints. No lies to unravel, no official denials to pick apart, no contradictory reports to compare. Just nothing. This is the information blackout. The deliberate creation of a void so total that the subject never even enters the public mind. Not because it was disproven, not because it was dismissed, but because it was never allowed to exist in the first place. A blackout is not silence in the ordinary sense. Ordinary silence happens when no one happens to be talking about something. A blackout is engineered silence, carefully maintained, constantly monitored, aggressively defended. It's the difference between an empty room and a locked, soundproof cell. One is absence, the other is confinement. In the early days of the Chernobyl disaster, Soviet authorities enacted an almost complete blackout. Residents weren't told about the explosion. No announcements were made. Newspapers didn't print a word. For nearly 2 days, people in nearby towns continued life as normal, sending children to play outside, working in gardens, hanging laundry, while invisible radiation rained down on them. It wasn't that they were ignoring danger. They didn't even know there was something to ignore. The power of an information blackout lies in its ability to erase not just answers, but questions. If you never hear about the protest that was violently suppressed, you won't ask why the police opened fire. If no one tells you a journalist has gone missing, you won't wonder who silenced them. And if an entire region is cut off from communication, its suffering might as well not exist. This tactic thrives in places where control over communication is centralized. Governments can enforce it by locking down media outlets, cutting internet access, or imposing strict penalties for publishing unauthorized material. Corporations can enforce it internally through non-disclosure agreements, threat of lawsuits, and tight control over internal communications. In both cases, the goal is the same, not to convince people of a false story, but to prevent any story from emerging at all. And yet, blackouts can be more fragile than they appear. They rely on absolute control, because once even a sliver of information escapes, curiosity spreads like wildfire. During World War II, military censors enforced strict blackouts on certain operations, but even one letter home from a soldier, hinting at the truth, could unravel months of silence. The blackout must be perfect, because the smallest leak can pierce it completely. But until that leak happens, a blackout shapes reality in a way lies never can. Lies invite challenge. Silence breeds nothing. If a false report is published, rival outlets can investigate, whistleblowers can expose it, citizens can debate it, But when there is no report, no mention, no trace, there is nothing to investigate. The public isn't resisting a falsehood. They're living in a vacuum, unaware there's even a missing piece. The psychological damage is immense. People living under long-term blackouts lose the instinct to question what's missing. They accept the visible world as the whole world. Entire generations can grow up believing that certain events, ideas, or possibilities simply don't exist. The space where those truths should have lived is quietly overwritten by other narratives. Safe narratives, approved narratives, until the original reality is gone without a fight. And here's the darkest twist. Once a blackout is lifted, even when the truth comes out, it rarely hits with full force. Time dulls outrage. Evidence disappears. Witnesses die. The event, when finally revealed, feels distant, something from a past too far away to change. In that way, the blackout doesn't just delay the truth. It ensures that, when it finally arrives, it's too weak to matter. We think censorship means tearing pages from a book. An information blackout is far worse. It's making sure the book is never written, which means that, right now, there could be stories, entire histories missing from your world. Not because you overlooked them, but because someone decided you would never see them in the first place. And the only question that matters is this. If something were being hidden from you so completely, how would you ever even know to look for it? Quiet urgency. There is an urgency that blares alarms and shouts orders. And then there is a far more dangerous kind. The urgency that says very little at all. Quiet urgency doesn't scream about deadlines or lay out the stakes in vivid detail. It moves in whispers and glances, in the subtle tightening of schedules, and the careful withholding of explanations. It's the feeling that you must act now. Without knowing why, you must act at all. And that is exactly how it gains its power. In a crisis, urgency is expected. If a building is on fire, you run. If a storm is coming, you evacuate. The danger is clear, the action is obvious. But quiet urgency operates in the fog. Someone tells you a decision needs to be made by the end of the day, but they don't tell you what's at risk if you wait. You are told to sign, approve, commit, without being told what happens if you don't. The clock is ticking, and the sound of it becomes louder than your own ability to think. This tactic thrives in boardrooms and political offices. A proposal lands on your desk with the instruction that it's time-sensitive. No one explains the context. The language is calm but insistent. The implication is that there is no time for debate, no time for review, no time to gather facts. The very absence of detail creates pressure. You start to fear that asking questions will make you the one who causes a delay, the one who doesn't get it, the one who costs everyone the opportunity. And so, you comply. In negotiations, quiet urgency is a weapon. A counterparty might mention that these terms are only available until the end of the meeting, without elaborating on why. The time constraint is just specific enough to force haste, but too vague to verify. You're not told whether the offer will disappear due to a competitor, a regulation, or pure whim. It doesn't matter. What matters is the manufactured scarcity of time, the artificial horizon that makes patience feel like recklessness. Even in personal relationships, quiet urgency can shape decisions that would never be made under the light of full understanding. Someone you trust says they need an answer now, tonight, before you go to sleep. They don't explain why the morning will be too late. They simply frame the delay as dangerous or damaging, letting your imagination fill in the worst possibilities. The less you know, the more your mind invents reasons to obey. Psychologically, this tactic works because humans are wired to avoid loss more than we are to seek gain. When faced with an unexplained time limit, our brain assumes that missing it could cost us something valuable: reputation, opportunity, safety, even if we have no proof. Quiet urgency manipulates that fear without revealing the true stakes. And in doing so, it takes away our ability to judge whether the rush is real or a mirage. In politics, this is how emergency laws get passed without scrutiny. Legislators are told they must act immediately to protect the nation. Hearings are shortened, debates are cut off, and bills are voted on without time for anyone to read them in full. Weeks later, the public learns what was inside, but by then, the law is already in effect, and reversing it would require a battle far harder than the one that was avoided in the rush. Corporations use quiet urgency in crises they don't want examined. A recall might be framed as effective immediately, with instructions to destroy documents or sign off on settlements within days. Employees are told it's for compliance reasons, without being told the details. The more opaque the reasoning, the less room there is for resistance. When people don't know what's at stake, they often err on the side of speed, exactly as intended. The genius of quiet urgency is that it doesn't have to prove itself. Loud urgency must be justified. If you shout fire in a crowded room, people will look for the smoke. Quiet urgency relies on the opposite instinct, that if something must be done quickly, the explanation will only slow you down. It encourages obedience not through volume, but through omission, and yet, the damage it causes is often permanent. Rushed contracts can bind you for years. Rushed legislation can reshape entire societies. Rushed personal decisions can alter the course of your life. The cost of not asking, why now, can be far greater than the cost of a missed deadline. But quiet urgency knows that in the moment, most people will choose action over understanding, speed over certainty. There are rare cases where quiet urgency is genuine, when speaking openly about the danger would cause more harm than good. In intelligence work, for example, revealing the reason for a rush could expose sources or compromise operations.
But in the vast majority of cases where it's used against the public, against workers, against partners, its purpose is not protection, it's control. It's about keeping you too busy moving to notice where you're being led. Defending against it requires a discipline that feels unnatural in the moment. You must be willing to stop, even when stopping feels unsafe. You must be willing to risk looking slow, looking cautious, looking difficult. The test is simple. If you are being asked to act quickly without knowing why, you are not being given urgency. You are being given a command disguised as one. And that is the truth about quiet urgency. It doesn't rely on force or threat or even persuasion. It relies on your own fear of hesitation. And if it succeeds, you will think you made the choice yourself, when in reality, you were simply running on a clock someone else wound for you. Because when the countdown starts and you don't know what happens at 0, the most dangerous thing isn't the time running out. It's that you were never told what you were really racing toward.